A simple errand turns into trouble. It was a sunny afternoon, and Lieutenant Colonel Olivia Daniels had just returned to her hometown of Charleston, South Carolina, after a year-long deployment overseas. For most people, a trip to the local grocery store might seem mundane, but for Olivia, it was a cherished moment of normalcy. After months of intense military operations, she found peace in the little things, selecting fresh produce, scanning shelves for her favorite snacks, and enjoying the quiet rhythm of civilian life. Dressed casually in a light gray sweater, jeans, and sneakers, Olivia blended seamlessly into the crowd. There were no visible signs of her decorated military career. No medals, no rank insignia, just an ordinary woman in her mid-40s doing her shopping. Despite her humble demeanor, Olivia carried herself with a quiet authority that years of service had instilled in her. As she pushed her shopping cart down the cereal aisle, Olivia heard a loud crash. Turning her head, she saw a police officer, his uniform crisp, badge gleaming, knock over a display of canned goods. Instead of picking them up, the officer glanced at the mess and shrugged before walking away, leaving the aisle in disarray. Olivia paused, her military training kicking in. Responsibility and accountability were core values she lived by, and witnessing someone in uniform disregard those principles struck a nerve. She approached the officer calmly. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice firm but respectful. "You dropped those cans. Could you please pick them up? Someone might trip over them." The officer, whose name tag read J. Wallace, turned to face her. He was tall, with a stocky build and an air of arrogance that seemed to follow him like a shadow. He raised an eyebrow, looking Olivia up and down, as if assessing her worth. "Who do you think you are, lady?" he scoffed. "I don't have time for that. Someone else will clean it up." Olivia stood her ground. "With all due respect, Officer Wallace, as someone representing the law, you should set an example. It's not just about the mess. It's about doing the right thing." Wallace's expression darkened. "Listen, lady, I don't need a lecture from you. Mind your own business before you regret it." Olivia could feel the tension rising, but she kept her composure. "I'm not here to argue, officer. I'm simply asking you to take responsibility." Her calm demeanor seemed to irritate Wallace further. "You think you're better than me," he snapped. "You don't know who you're dealing with. People like you should learn to stay in their lane." The phrase, "people like you," hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Olivia knew exactly what he meant, but she refused to let his prejudice intimidate her. "I'm asking you one last time," she said, her voice steady. "Pick up the cans and show some respect for your position." Wallace sneered, stepping closer to her. "And if I don't, what are you going to do about it?" The confrontation had caught the attention of other shoppers. A few had stopped to watch, their curiosity piqued by the escalating tension. Some discreetly pulled out their phones, recording the scene. "I'll do what's necessary," Olivia replied, her tone unwavering. "Your behavior is unacceptable, and I won't stand by and let it go unchecked." Wallace let out a mocking laugh. "You're really pushing your luck, lady." At that moment, Olivia's phone buzzed in her pocket. She ignored it, keeping her focus on Wallace, who seemed determined to provoke her. The officer's smug expression made it clear he thought he held all the power in this situation. "Fine," Olivia said finally. "If you won't clean it up, I'll report this to your department." "Actions have consequences, Officer Wallace." Wallace's eyes narrowed. "Is that a threat?" "It's a promise," Olivia replied. Before she could say more, Wallace abruptly raised his voice. "You're causing a disturbance. I'm warning you. Back off, or you'll regret it." His loud declaration startled the nearby shoppers. Olivia didn't flinch. Instead, she folded her arms and stood her ground, her eyes locked on his. "Do what you have to do," she said simply. Wallace reached for his radio, his hand hovering over his sidearm, as if to intimidate her. The sight of his hand near the weapon sent a ripple of unease through the crowd. A few gasps could be heard as people backed away, unsure of what might happen next. The tension in the air was palpable. Olivia remained calm, but her mind raced. She had faced life-threatening situations before, but this was different. This wasn't a battlefield. It was a grocery store, a place where people should feel safe. "You've got some nerve," Wallace muttered, his voice low but menacing. "I think it's time you learned your place." Olivia stared him down, her resolve unshaken. "And I think it's time you remembered yours." Before Wallace could respond, a voice from the crowd broke the silence. "Hey, leave her alone." A young woman holding a phone stepped forward, her camera aimed at Wallace. "I've got this all on video," she said, her voice trembling but determined. "You're way out of line." Wallace turned his glare to the woman, but the sight of the recording device seemed to give him pause. Olivia took the opportunity to speak. "This is your chance to walk away, Officer Wallace," she said. "Do the right thing before this gets worse." For a moment, it seemed like he might listen. His hand dropped from his radio, and his posture relaxed slightly. But then, as if to reassert his authority, he stepped even closer to Olivia, his expression defiant. "You don't scare me," he hissed. "I don't care who you think you are." The standoff continued, the crowd holding its collective breath. Olivia knew this was far from over, but she also knew she couldn't back down. Not now, not ever. The unmasking of a dangerous ego. The tension in the air was thick as Officer Wallace continued to loom over Olivia, his arrogance unfazed. His uniform, meant to symbolize protection and order, felt more like a weapon of intimidation in this moment. The crowd around them grew larger, phones raised to document the unfolding drama. Olivia's calm demeanor stood in stark contrast to Wallace's fiery temper, but beneath her composed exterior, she was calculating her next move. "Lady," Wallace growled, his voice low and threatening, "if you don't walk away right now, I'll have no choice but to remove you myself." Olivia didn't flinch. Instead, she looked him straight in the eye, her voice steady. "Remove me for what, Officer Wallace? Asking you to pick up your mess, or standing up to your disrespect?" The onlookers murmured, and Wallace's jaw tightened. His gaze flickered briefly to the crowd before returning to Olivia. He seemed to realize he was no longer in control of the narrative, and that only fueled his anger. "You're disrupting public order," he barked, raising his voice to an authoritative pitch, as if the volume alone could mask the weakness of his argument. "Step aside before I escalate this situation." The words hung heavy in the air, but Olivia stood firm. "Escalate it how, officer?" "By abusing your power, by drawing attention to your inability to act with integrity." Wallace's face flushed red with frustration. "You're testing me." "No," Olivia said, her voice calm but cutting. "I'm holding you accountable." At that moment, another voice joined the fray. A middle-aged man in a business suit stepped forward, his phone also raised. "Officer, I think you're the one disrupting public order here. We all saw what happened, and we're recording it." Wallace's head whipped around, his eyes narrowing at the man. "Stay out of this," he snapped, his voice tinged with desperation. "This doesn't concern you." The man didn't back down. "It concerns all of us when someone in uniform abuses their authority." The crowd murmured in agreement, emboldened by the man's words. Wallace's grip on the situation was slipping, and he knew it. But instead of de-escalating, he doubled down. "Enough," he shouted, reaching for his radio. "I'm calling backup." Olivia's eyes sharpened, her instincts kicking into high gear. She had seen this play out before. Men like Wallace, fueled by ego and prejudice, often escalated conflicts unnecessarily. She wasn't about to let this situation spiral out of control. "Call whoever you need to," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the rising tension. "But know this, you're only digging yourself deeper." Wallace paused, his hand hovering over the radio. For a brief moment, it seemed as if her words had reached him. But then his expression hardened, and he pressed the button. "Unit 42, I need assistance at the corner market," he barked into the device. "Code 10 to 32. Olivia's stomach tightened, A 10 to 32 call meant he was requesting emergency backup, likely claiming there was a combative suspect. It was a gross exaggeration of the situation, and she knew it. But she also knew how quickly these things could escalate once other officers arrived. The crowd, sensing the gravity of the situation, began to stir uneasily. Some people backed away, while others shouted protests. One woman yelled, "She hasn't done anything wrong." Another man added, "This is harassment." Wallace ignored them, his focus solely on Olivia. "You've made your point, lady," he said coldly. "Now step aside before things get worse." Olivia's mind raced. She had faced life-threatening situations in war zones, but this was different. Here, the stakes weren't just her safety. They were about justice, about standing up against an abuse of power. She took a deep breath, grounding herself in her training. "Officer Wallace," she said, her voice calm but firm, "I am a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army. I have served this country for over 2 decades, leading troops in some of the most dangerous regions in the world. I know what real courage and leadership look like, and I can tell you now, you are neither courageous nor a leader." Her words struck a chord, drawing gasps and murmurs from the crowd. Wallace's face contorted with rage. "You think your fancy title means anything to me?" He spat. "You're just a—" "Careful," Olivia interjected, her tone sharp. "Finish that sentence, and you'll regret it." Wallace faltered, the weight of her unwavering gaze unnerving him. But before he could respond, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. The crowd parted as 2 police cruisers pulled up to the store. 4 officers stepped out, their expressions a mix of confusion and concern as they surveyed the scene. Wallace immediately waved them over. "Glad you're here," he said, his tone suddenly authoritative. "This woman has been causing a disturbance and refusing to comply. She needs to be removed." One of the officers, a sergeant with a calm demeanor, approached Olivia. "Ma'am, what's going on here?" Olivia didn't hesitate. "This officer has been disrespectful, abusive, and reckless," she said, her voice steady. "He knocked over a display, refused to clean it up, and then tried to intimidate me when I called him out on it. He escalated the situation by calling for backup unnecessarily." The sergeant looked from Olivia to Wallace, his brow furrowing. "Is this true, Officer Wallace?" Wallace scoffed. "She's lying. She was confrontational from the start." Before the sergeant could respond, one of the bystanders stepped forward, holding up their phone. "I have it all on video," they said. "She didn't do anything wrong. He's been out of line since the beginning." The sergeant's expression darkened as he took the phone and began reviewing the footage. The other officers watched over his shoulder, their faces grim as they saw the evidence of Wallace's behavior. When the sergeant finished, he turned to Wallace, his voice cold. "Officer Wallace, step aside. We'll handle this." Wallace's eyes widened. "What? You're taking her side?" "I'm taking the side of the truth," the sergeant said firmly. "Your actions are unacceptable, and there will be consequences." The sergeant turned back to Olivia. "Ma'am, I apologize for this incident. We'll ensure it's addressed appropriately." Olivia nodded, her expression unreadable. "Thank you, Sergeant. I hope this serves as a reminder that accountability is essential, no matter the uniform." As the officers escorted Wallace out of the store, the crowd erupted into applause. Olivia stood tall, her composure intact despite the ordeal. She knew this was just the beginning of a larger fight. But for now, justice had been served. Outside, as the police cruisers pulled away, Olivia glanced at the young woman who had stepped forward to record the incident. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "Your courage made a difference today." The woman smiled nervously. "I just did what I thought was right." Olivia placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "That's all any of us can do." With that, she returned to her shopping, her head held high. She knew the road ahead would be challenging, but she was ready for whatever came next. A reckoning begins. The store had settled into an uneasy quiet after Officer Wallace's dramatic removal. Most of the crowd had dispersed, though a few lingered, discussing the incident in hushed tones. Olivia continued her shopping, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She knew that what had transpired today was not an isolated incident. Men like Wallace were symptoms of a deeper problem, a lack of accountability in positions of authority. As she placed a carton of eggs into her cart, a store manager approached her hesitantly. A middle-aged man with a kind face and a nervous demeanor, he adjusted his name tag, which read Martin, before speaking. "Ma'am, I just wanted to say I'm sorry for what happened," he said, his voice tinged with embarrassment. "We don't condone that kind of behavior in our store." Olivia turned to him, her expression softening. "Thank you, Martin, but this isn't your fault. It's a systemic issue, and it needs to be addressed." Martin nodded, glancing around as if ensuring they were out of earshot of any lingering shoppers. "If there's anything I can do to help, please let me know." That officer's behavior was disgraceful. Olivia smiled faintly. "Just keep treating people with respect, Martin. That's the most anyone can do." As she made her way to the checkout line, her phone buzzed again. This time, she pulled it out, recognizing the number as one of her old colleagues from the base. She answered, keeping her voice low. "Olivia Daniels," she said. "Colonel Daniels," came the familiar voice of Major David Harper, her longtime confidant and friend. "I just saw the footage from the store. Are you okay?" Olivia's brow furrowed. "The footage? How?" "It's already on social media," Harper interrupted. "Someone posted it, and it's spreading fast. You're all over the internet." Olivia sighed, closing her eyes for a moment. "That didn't take long." "I wanted to check on you," Harper continued. "This kind of attention can get messy." "I'm fine," Olivia said firmly. "But this incident highlights a bigger problem, and I'm not going to let it slide." Harper hesitated. "You're planning to take action, aren't you?" "Of course," Olivia replied. "Wallace isn't the first officer to abuse his power, and he won't be the last unless someone makes an example of him." Harper chuckled dryly. "I should have known you wouldn't let this go. Just be careful. The internet has a way of twisting things." "I appreciate the concern," Olivia said, "but I've faced worse than internet trolls. This needs to be done." As she ended the call and paid for her groceries, her resolve hardened. The footage might have gone viral without her consent, but it could serve as a catalyst for change. She decided to take the next step, filing a formal complaint and ensuring that Wallace faced the full consequences of his actions. The next day, filing the complaint, Olivia arrived at the Charleston Police Department early the next morning, her uniform crisp and her demeanor resolute. Though she preferred to stay out of the limelight, she knew that her rank and reputation would lend weight to her complaint. The receptionist at the front desk looked up, startled by Olivia's commanding presence. "Good morning, ma'am. How can I help you?" "I'm here to file a formal complaint against Officer J. Wallace," Olivia said, her voice firm but polite. "I'd like to speak with whoever is in charge of internal investigations." The receptionist nodded, her expression serious. "Of course. Please wait here while I inform Captain Rivera." Minutes later, Olivia was escorted into a conference room where Captain Elena Rivera, a seasoned officer with a reputation for fairness, was waiting. Rivera rose to greet her, extending a hand. "Colonel Daniels," she said, her tone respectful. "I've already seen the footage from yesterday's incident. Please, have a seat." Olivia took a seat across from Rivera, placing a folder of documents on the table. "Thank you, Captain. I've prepared a detailed account of what happened, along with the video evidence and witness statements that have been shared with me." Rivera raised an eyebrow. "You work quickly." Olivia gave a faint smile. "Years of military training. Efficiency is second nature." Rivera reviewed the folder silently, her expression growing graver with each page. When she finished, she looked up, her eyes meeting Olivia's. "This is damning evidence," Rivera said. "Wallace's actions are unacceptable, and they tarnish the reputation of our entire department. I assure you, an internal investigation will be launched immediately." "I appreciate that," Olivia said. But an investigation isn't enough. This is about more than one officer. It's about the culture that allows people like Wallace to thrive. I hope your department takes this as an opportunity to implement real change. Rivera nodded. I agree, Colonel. And I'll do everything in my power to ensure this doesn't get swept under the rug. As Olivia left the police station, she felt a sense of satisfaction, but she knew the battle was far from over. Public pressure would be key to ensuring accountability, and she was prepared to use her voice to amplify the issue. The fallout. Over the next few days, the video of Wallace's behavior continued to gain traction online. News outlets picked up the story, framing it as a powerful example of standing up to abuse of authority. Olivia's calm yet firm demeanor in the face of Wallace's aggression became a focal point, earning her widespread admiration. However, not all reactions were positive. Online trolls and detractors surfaced, questioning her motives and accusing her of seeking attention. Olivia ignored the noise, focusing instead on the growing support from community leaders, activists, and even fellow military personnel. One evening, she received an email from a local advocacy group, inviting her to speak at a town hall meeting on police reform. Though public speaking wasn't her favorite activity, Olivia recognized the opportunity to push for meaningful change. At the town hall, she shared her story, emphasizing the importance of accountability and integrity in positions of power. Her speech resonated with the audience, sparking a passionate discussion about systemic reform. Wallace's reckoning. Meanwhile, the investigation into Wallace's conduct moved swiftly. Rivera kept her promise, ensuring that the evidence was thoroughly reviewed. The findings were damning. Wallace had a history of complaints for misconduct, many of which had been quietly dismissed. Faced with mounting pressure from both the public and within the department, Wallace was not only terminated but also charged with misconduct and intimidation. The case became a turning point for the Charleston Police Department, prompting a comprehensive review of its policies and training programs. Olivia's reflection. As the weeks passed, Olivia reflected on the whirlwind of events. Though she had never sought the spotlight, she was proud of the impact her actions had made. The incident at the grocery store had been a moment of reckoning, not just for Wallace, but for a system that needed change. One evening, as she sat on her porch with a cup of tea, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from a young woman who had been in the store that day. "Thank you for standing up to him," the message read. "You've inspired me to speak out too." Olivia smiled, feeling the sense of fulfillment. The fight for justice was far from over, but she was ready for whatever came next. Ripples of change. The ripple effects of Olivia's confrontation with Officer Wallace began to spread far beyond the grocery store and the Charleston Police Department. Social media had turned her into a symbol of accountability, integrity, and courage, though she hadn't sought the spotlight. Public forums buzzed with discussions about her actions, her rank, and the message she had conveyed so powerfully. No one, not even those in uniform, is above the principles of respect and responsibility. For Olivia, life hadn't slowed down. She had a full schedule of meetings, interviews, and advocacy efforts. While part of her longed to return to the quiet rhythm of her military duties, she knew she had a unique opportunity to push for systemic reform, and she wasn't about to let it slip away. The community rally. One afternoon, Olivia received an invitation to a community rally organized by local activists. The theme of the event was accountability for all, and its goal was to bring together law enforcement, military personnel, and citizens to discuss tangible steps toward reforming practices and improving relations. Initially hesitant, Olivia accepted, recognizing the importance of showing solidarity. The rally was held in a large city park, where a stage had been set up with banners and signs advocating justice, fairness, and equality. When Olivia arrived, she was greeted by the event organizer, a passionate young man named Terrence Wright. His enthusiasm was infectious. "Colonel Daniels," Terrence said, shaking her hand firmly. "It's an honor to have you here. Your story has inspired so many of us to stand up and demand better." "Thank you, Terence," Olivia said, her voice warm but measured. "I'm here because I believe change starts with conversations like these." As the event began, Olivia watched from backstage as various speakers took to the podium. Among them were community leaders, activists, and even a retired police captain who spoke candidly about the need for cultural shifts within law enforcement. When it was her turn, Olivia stepped onto the stage to a standing ovation. The crowd's energy was palpable, and for a moment, she felt the weight of their expectations. She adjusted the microphone and began. "Thank you for your warm welcome," she said. "I stand before you not as a hero or a symbol, but as someone who believes in accountability, justice, and the power of unity." She shared the story of her encounter with Wallace, emphasizing the importance of holding individuals accountable while addressing the systemic issues that allowed such behavior to persist. "Courage isn't about standing up to one person," she said, her voice strong. "It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable or inconvenient. It's about ensuring that every person, regardless of their background, is treated with dignity and respect." Her words resonated deeply, sparking applause and cheers. She ended her speech with a call to action. "This isn't about me. This is about us, our community, our values, and our future. Change is possible, but it requires all of us to act." A conversation with leadership. The rally wasn't the only platform Olivia had been invited to address. Following the event, she was contacted by Charleston's mayor and the chief of police, who requested a private meeting to discuss potential reforms. Olivia agreed, hoping to push for meaningful changes from the top down. The meeting took place in City Hall, in a stately conference room overlooking the city's historic district. Mayor Evelyn Grayson, a pragmatic yet empathetic leader, greeted Olivia warmly. "Colonel Daniels," Grayson said, "thank you for meeting with us. Your story has shone a spotlight on issues we've been grappling with for years." Beside her sat Police Chief Anthony Ramirez, a seasoned officer known for his progressive stance on reform. Ramirez leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Colonel," he began, "I want to apologize on behalf of the department for what you experienced. Wallace's actions were inexcusable, and he has been held accountable. But I know this isn't just about one officer. We need to do better." Olivia appreciated the candor, but didn't let her guard down. "Chief Ramirez, I understand the challenges you face. But the responsibility of leadership is to create a culture where accountability isn't just an ideal. It's a standard." Grayson nodded. "We're here to listen, Colonel. What changes would you suggest?" Olivia had come prepared. She outlined a series of recommendations, including mandatory bias training, stricter protocols for handling complaints, and the establishment of a civilian oversight board. She also emphasized the importance of community engagement, suggesting regular town halls and open forums where citizens could voice their concerns. "I've seen what true leadership looks like," Olivia concluded. "It's not about exerting power. It's about earning trust." Grayson and Ramirez exchanged thoughtful glances. The mayor spoke first. "Your insights are invaluable, Colonel. We're committed to implementing these changes, but we'll need your continued guidance." "I'm willing to help," Olivia said, "but this isn't about me. It's about ensuring that everyone, from the most junior officer to the highest-ranking leader, is held to the same standard." The backlash. As the reform initiatives gained momentum, Olivia faced her share of resistance. Not everyone was pleased with her rising influence, particularly within certain factions of the police force. Anonymous messages flooded her inbox, ranging from dismissive criticisms to outright threats. "You think you can waltz in and tell us how to do our jobs?" One email read. "Stay in your lane, Colonel." Olivia forwarded the threats to the authorities, but she refused to be intimidated. If anything, the backlash strengthened her resolve. She knew that change often provoked resistance, especially from those invested in maintaining the status quo. One evening, as she reviewed documents related to the Civilian Oversight Board, her phone rang. It was Major Harper. "Olivia, are you okay?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. "I heard about the threats." "I'm fine, David," she replied. "This isn't the first time I've faced adversity." "I know," Harper said, "but this is different. It's personal." "It's always personal when you're fighting for justice," Olivia said firmly. "But I'm not backing down." Harper sighed. "Just promise me you'll stay vigilant. You're making a difference, but I don't want you to pay too high a price." "I'll be careful," Olivia assured him. "But I won't stop." A glimmer of hope. Despite the challenges, Olivia began to see signs of progress. The Charleston Police Department announced the launch of its first-ever civilian oversight board, and Ramirez implemented new protocols for addressing misconduct. Community members reported a renewed sense of trust in local law enforcement, though Olivia knew there was still much work to be done. One evening, she received a letter from a young cadet in the police academy. The letter read, "Colonel Daniels, I wanted to thank you for your courage. Your actions have inspired me to be the kind of officer who leads with integrity and respect. I hope to make a difference, just like you." The letter brought a smile to Olivia's face. It was a reminder that even the smallest ripple could spark waves of change. As she folded the letter and placed it in her desk, Olivia reflected on the journey ahead. The fight for accountability was far from over, but she was ready to continue. After all, courage wasn't just about standing up to injustice. It was about standing firm, even when the path was uncertain. And Olivia Daniels was no stranger to the weight of leadership. Shadows of opposition. While the reforms spearheaded by Olivia Daniels gained momentum, not everyone embraced the changes. As the new policies were announced, mandatory bias training, the creation of a civilian oversight board, and stricter accountability measures, dissent simmered in the background. Some officers, particularly those who had grown accustomed to a culture of unchecked authority, viewed these changes as an attack on their autonomy. Among the most vocal opponents was a retired sergeant, Victor Monroe, who had served with Officer Wallace. A relic of the old guard, Monroe had built his career on a tough-on-crime approach that often blurred the lines between enforcement and abuse of power. Now he saw Olivia's actions as a personal affront. "She's undermining everything we stand for," Monroe declared during an interview on a local radio station. His voice was gruff, filled with indignation. "People like her don't understand what it takes to be a cop. They sit behind desks and make rules for situations they've never experienced." The host, a younger journalist who was sympathetic to Olivia's cause, pushed back. "Colonel Daniels is a decorated military officer who has led troops in combat zones. Doesn't that give her a unique perspective on leadership and accountability?" Monroe scoffed. "Military's not the same as law enforcement. Out there, it's black and white, enemy or ally. Here, we deal with gray areas every day. And she's trying to make our job impossible." The interview aired during morning drive time, reaching thousands of listeners. Within hours, clips of Monroe's statements circulated online, drawing both support and criticism. For Olivia, it was a stark reminder of the challenges ahead. She had anticipated resistance, but Monroe's rhetoric threatened to divide the community she was working so hard to unite. A quiet threat. As public discourse grew more polarized, Olivia began receiving anonymous letters at her home. Most were harmless expressions of disagreement, but one letter, delivered in a plain white envelope, stood out. Inside was a single piece of paper with a chilling message. "Stop before it's too late." The handwriting was crude, the tone unmistakably threatening. Olivia stared at the words for a long moment, her mind racing. She had faced danger before, but this was different. This was personal. She reported the letter to the authorities, who assured her they would investigate. Still, Olivia couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that someone was watching her, waiting for her to falter. Determined not to let fear control her, Olivia doubled down on her efforts. She reached out to community leaders, law enforcement allies, and even skeptical officers, inviting them to participate in roundtable discussions. Her goal was clear: to bridge the gap between those who demanded reform and those who resisted it. A divided table. One such discussion took place in a community center on Charleston's east side. The roundtable included a diverse group: activists, clergy, business owners, and police officers, including Monroe himself. Olivia knew his presence would be contentious, but she welcomed the opportunity to confront his objections directly. The meeting began cordially, with participants introducing themselves and sharing their perspectives. Olivia listened intently, taking notes as each person spoke. When it was Monroe's turn, he wasted no time making his stance clear. "These reforms are going to tie the hands of good officers," he said, his tone sharp. "You're asking us to second-guess every decision, to hesitate when lives are on the line. That hesitation could cost someone their life." Olivia met his gaze, her expression calm but firm. "Sergeant Monroe, I understand your concerns, but accountability doesn't weaken law enforcement. It strengthens it. When officers act with integrity, they earn the trust of the communities they serve." Monroe leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "Trust won't save an officer in a dangerous situation. Split-second decisions don't leave room for oversight. That's why training is so critical." Olivia replied. "Bias training, de-escalation techniques, scenario-based exercises. These aren't just bureaucratic hoops. They're tools that save lives, both for officers and civilians." The room fell silent as the tension between them grew. Finally, a young officer spoke up, breaking the stalemate. "I've been through the new training," she said quietly. "At first, I thought it was a waste of time. But then I realized how much it made me think about my actions, about how I can do my job without escalating situations unnecessarily." Her words seemed to shift the energy in the room. Other participants began nodding, sharing their own experiences and insights. Even Monroe appeared to soften slightly, though he remained skeptical. Turning the tide. As the weeks passed, Olivia's persistence began to yield results. The first civilian oversight board meeting was held, with a diverse group of members representing various sectors of the community. The board's mandate was clear: to review complaints against officers, ensure transparency, and recommend disciplinary actions when necessary. At the same time, the police department reported an increase in community engagement. Officers who had initially resisted the reforms began participating in neighborhood events, building relationships with residents, and addressing long-standing grievances. One officer, a young man named Ryan Chavis, approached Olivia after a community meeting. "Colonel Daniels," he said, his voice hesitant, "I wanted to thank you. At first, I didn't agree with these changes, but now I see how much of a difference they're making. I'm proud to be part of this department again." Olivia smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "Thank you, Officer Chaves. Your willingness to adapt and grow is what real leadership looks like." The breaking point. Despite the progress, opposition remained. Monroe and his allies continued to stoke fear and division, accusing Olivia of undermining law enforcement. Their rhetoric reached a fever pitch when a minor incident involving an officer and a civilian was blown out of proportion, sparking protests across the city. Olivia knew the stakes were high. If the reforms failed, it would embolden those who resisted change and set back years of progress. But if they succeeded, it could serve as a model for other communities grappling with similar issues. One evening, as she reviewed reports on the Oversight Board's progress, her phone buzzed with a text from Major Harper. "The road is rough, but you're making a difference. Stay the course." Olivia stared at the message, her resolve strengthening. She knew the journey was far from over, but she also knew she wasn't alone. With allies like Harper, the community, and even some within law enforcement, she believed that lasting change was possible. A new beginning. As the opposition's influence waned, the city began to heal. Relationships between officers and residents improved, and incidents of misconduct decreased. The reforms, though still a work in progress, had begun to take root. For Olivia, the victory wasn't just about policy changes. It was about the lives those policies would protect. She knew the fight for justice was never truly over, but she was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Sitting on her porch one evening, watching the sun set over Charleston, Olivia allowed herself a rare moment of peace. She had fought battles on many fronts, but this one was different. This battle was for the soul of her community, and it was a fight she intended to win. A legacy of justice. The sun rose over Charleston, its light bathing the city in a golden hue, symbolizing a new day and new beginnings. For Olivia Daniels, the past few months had been some of the most challenging of her life. Yet, as she stood on the steps of City Hall, preparing to deliver a speech to a gathering crowd, she felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. The city had undergone a transformation. The reforms Olivia had fought for were not only implemented, but were showing tangible results. Officers were building trust with the communities they served. Complaints of misconduct were addressed transparently, and the Civilian Oversight Board was actively holding the police department accountable. But Olivia knew this was only the beginning, the culmination of efforts. The event was titled A Day of Accountability and Unity, organized to celebrate the progress made while acknowledging the work that remained. The gathering was a mix of citizens, law enforcement officers, community leaders, and activists, all united under a common goal: justice and equality for all. As Olivia stepped up to the podium, the crowd fell silent. Her presence commanded attention, not through intimidation, but through the respect she had earned by standing firm in her values. Dressed in her military uniform, she represented not just her rank, but the ideals she had fought to uphold. "Good morning," Olivia began, her voice steady and strong. "Today, we stand at a crossroads, not just as a city, but as a society. Over the past months, we've confronted uncomfortable truths, challenged long-standing systems, and taken steps toward meaningful change. But this journey is far from over." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the crowd. The fight for justice is not a sprint. It's a marathon. It requires courage, resilience, and most importantly, unity. We've seen what can happen when we work together, when we refuse to accept the status quo, and when we demand accountability from those in positions of power. Her words resonated deeply, drawing applause from the audience. She continued, addressing the challenges they had faced. "I won't pretend this has been easy," she said. "Change never is. We've faced resistance, fear, and even hostility. But we've also seen the power of solidarity. We've witnessed officers who were once skeptical embrace these reforms and become champions of justice. We've seen communities come together to support one another, to heal, and to rebuild trust. The power of a unified front." Among the attendees were Officer Ryan Chavez, who had become a vocal advocate for the reforms, and several members of the Civilian Oversight Board. Also present was Captain Elena Rivera, who had worked tirelessly to implement the changes within the department. Standing side by side, they represented the success of Olivia's efforts to bridge divides and foster collaboration. As Olivia spoke, she acknowledged their contributions. "Today, I want to thank the brave men and women who have embraced these changes, not out of obligation, but out of a genuine desire to serve and protect with integrity." To Officer Chavez, Captain Rivera, and every individual who has taken a stand for what is right, you are the true leaders of this movement. The crowd erupted in applause, and Chavez felt a swell of pride. His journey from skeptic to advocate had been difficult, but hearing Olivia's words made it all worthwhile. The challenges that remain. Despite the celebratory atmosphere, Olivia didn't shy away from addressing the challenges that remained. "While we've made progress, let's not mistake this for the finish line," she said. "There are still those who resist change, who cling to outdated mindsets and systems that perpetuate injustice. Our work must continue, not with anger, but with determination. Not with division, but with unity." Her words carried weight, especially for those who had been critical of her efforts. Even retired Sergeant Victor Monroe, who had reluctantly attended the event, found himself reflecting on her message. He still harbored doubts, but he couldn't ignore the positive impact the reforms were having on the city. a surprising ally. After the speech, Monroe approached Olivia. The two had clashed publicly during the early stages of the reform efforts, but today his demeanor was different. He extended a hand, his expression a mix of respect and resignation. "Colonel Daniels," he said gruffly, "I still don't agree with everything you've done, but I can't deny the results. The department's better for it. Maybe I was wrong about some things." Olivia shook his hand, her expression softening. "Change is hard, Sergeant Monroe. It's natural to resist what feels unfamiliar. But the fact that you're here today speaks volumes. Thank you for being willing to listen." Monroe nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Don't let it go to your head." They shared a brief laugh, and for the first time, Olivia felt a glimmer of hope that even the staunchest opponents of reform could be reached. The legacy begins. As the event drew to a close, Olivia stood off to the side, watching as people mingled and shared their stories. She felt a sense of fulfillment knowing that her efforts had sparked a movement that would outlast her. This wasn't just about her or even the city of Charleston. It was about creating a model for others to follow, a blueprint for justice that could be replicated nationwide. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she saw a text from Major David Harper. "Watched your speech online. Proud of you, Olivia. You're changing the game." She smiled, typing a quick reply. "Couldn't have done it without your support. This is just the beginning. A future to fight for." That evening, Olivia returned home to her modest house on the outskirts of the city. Sitting on her porch with a cup of tea, she reflected on how far she had come. The journey had been grueling, filled with obstacles and sacrifices, but it had also been deeply rewarding. As she gazed at the stars, she thought about the countless individuals who had inspired her along the way. The young officer who embraced reform, the community members who stood by her, and even those who opposed her but eventually came around. They were all part of the story, a testament to the power of persistence and the human capacity for growth. For Olivia Daniels, the fight for justice would never truly end. But tonight, she allowed herself a moment of peace, knowing that she had laid the foundation for a better future. And in her heart, she carried the unshakable belief that courage, integrity, and unity could overcome even the darkest shadows. The legacy she had begun was no longer hers alone. It belonged to everyone who dared to dream of a world where justice was not just an ideal, but a reality.